History books rarely blush. They'll talk about war, famine, and torture before they whisper a word about arousal. And yet, desire is older than agriculture. It was there before the plough, before the wheel, before writing. It didn't need a language to announce itself. It only needed a glance, a gesture, a scent carried on the wind. And so begins the quiet truth of civilization. We didn't build cities just for safety or grain. We built them because we were horny. Not in the poetic sense, not in the grand, tragic, candlelit yearning sense. No, the raw, inconvenient, logistical kind. The kind that sneaks in between trade negotiations and temple duties. The kind that breaks laws, rewrites myths, and funds entire empires, one coin at a time. That kind. Long before ink touched clay, someone was carving breasts into stone. The Venus figurines, found scattered across Ice Age Europe, don't apologise for what they are. Wide hips, heavy breasts, no face, just fertility, unapologetic and portable. Not religious icons, not art in the modern sense. These were symbols or signals, maybe invitations, and maybe they were just what someone wanted to hold in their hand when the cold nights stretched a little too long. Desire in prehistory had no script, but it had patterns. In the cave walls of Chauvet and Lascaux, we find animals in motion, hunted, running, colliding, but beside them barely acknowledged by the textbooks are occasional human figures, and sometimes symbols we don't fully understand. One in particular, an inverted triangle scratched beside a dancing shaman, has led some scholars to suggest the earliest cave art may have doubled as erotica, porn, 30,000 years before playboys were hidden under mattresses. The oldest known problem wasn't agriculture, it was how to sneak a moment of pleasure when 10 other people were sleeping beside you, in a one-room shelter made of bone and hide. Privacy didn't exist, which means shame didn't either. When a clan lived, hunted, ate and slept together, bodies weren't sacred temples, they were just tools, and pleasure wasn't a confession. It was survival. Pair bonding, even temporary, meant support. Sex meant warmth. And in an environment where half your children wouldn't survive the winter, lust wasn't sinful, it was adaptive. But survival and satisfaction don't always agree. As early societies transitioned from foragers to farmers, the walls went up, physically and morally. Land ownership meant lineage mattered. Lineage meant controlling female sexuality. Suddenly, it wasn't just about who you wanted, it was about whose child you might carry. And from that concern came the invention of paternity paranoia, the foundation of every patriarchal law to come. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest known legal systems from Sumer, around 2100 BCE, penalised adultery with death, but only under certain conditions. A married woman caught with another man, executed. A man with a prostitute, a fine maybe. It wasn't about morality, it was about property. A wife was an investment, her desire inconvenient, her body notarized. Still, people didn't stop. The evidence is everywhere, in the rooms of ancient Mesopotamian brothels, crude beds, clay tokens, records of payments, in the goddess Inanna's hymns which describe her vulva as a divine garden, and her lover's penis as a plough sent by the gods. The boundary between sacred and sensual didn't exist. The temple was the bedroom, and the priestess, sometimes the prostitute. Egypt followed suit, though with a little more subtlety. Love poetry from the New Kingdom reads like diary entries, smuggled from adolescence. My heart flutters hastily when I think of my love. It lets me not act sensibly. These weren't just romantic, they were explicit. Euphemisms for nipples, for drinking, for intertwining bodies, all written on papyri read aloud during festivals. The gods themselves set the tone. Hathor, goddess of love, laughter and drunkenness, was also the patron of music and erotic dance. At her festivals, men and women drank until their limbs forgot their station, and what happened next was chalked up to divine ecstasy. In Greece, things became more intellectual, at least on the surface. Philosophers debated love, attraction, and the purpose of eros. Plato tried to elevate it, separating body from soul, but the average Athenian wasn't reading Plato. They were visiting heterae, educated courtesans who could quote Homer between massages, or scribbling graffiti in public latrines. One such note, found in a tavern in Delos, reads, "I screwed the innkeeper's wife. It was divine, academic indeed. Desire is democratic. It doesn't ask for your class, your creed, your calendar." In India, the Kama Sutra, often misunderstood as a sex manual, was actually a guide to pleasure in all its forms. Conversation, flirtation, sense, textures, staging. It was theatre, and yet, even it placed sex firmly within the bounds of marriage or sanctioned affairs. What you did was less important than who saw you do it, because by this point shame had arrived, and it wore many robes. Roman law turned adultery into a state matter. The Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis allowed fathers to kill daughters caught in the act. Husbands could divorce without financial penalty, but again, the punishment was never equal. A wife caught cheating faced exile. A husband, just a slap on the wrist, unless he went after another man's wife. And even then, it was more about insult than ethics. Still, the heart beats on, and the loins. In Pompeii, buried under ash, archaeologists found not just brothels, but homes with murals of gods mid-act. Mercury receiving a handjob, Priapus balancing his comically large erection on a scale. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't censored. These weren't degenerate images, they were invitations to laugh, to feel, to remember that before the lava came there was joy. The Middle Ages tried to smother that joy with incense and sermons. Christianity took a different approach. Sex was sacred, but only within marriage, and only for procreation. Anything else, oral, anal, or even too much eye contact, was sin. Monks documented their nocturnal emissions with horror. "The devil came upon me in sleep," one wrote, "and I awoke unclean." Guilt, weaponized. But no matter how many rules were etched into stone or whispered from pulpits, people found ways. Secret notes hidden under bread loaves, rendezvous in bathhouses, codes scratched into walls. And always, always, the knowledge that to feel desire was to feel human, dangerously, beautifully human. So what did people do when they got horny in ancient times? Everything. They carved it, they sang it, they sold it, they sinned, prayed, rationalized, and whispered. They lied about it, they died for it, they built empires on it, and through it all, they never stopped wanting. Because this isn't just history, it's biology, politics, art, crime, law, rebellion, religion, and poetry, all tangled in the sheets. This is the oldest problem, and it never went away. Privacy is a luxury, and in the ancient world, it wasn't on the menu. Your ancestors lived in tight quarters. One room, maybe two, if you were rich. Families stacked like firewood, children, parents, grandparents, cousins, all under one roof, eating from the same bowl, breathing the same stale air. There were no bedrooms, just bed mats, and no shame, because there was nowhere to hide it. Sex wasn't a retreat behind a closed door. It was a negotiation with the people lying next to you. A cough here, a polite turning of the back, maybe a loud song sung by someone who understood the hint. And if you couldn't wait, you didn't. Because life was short, baths were rare, and arousal didn't care about who was in the room. In early agricultural villages, Tatal for instance, houses were accessed through the roof. No streets, no doors. You walked across your neighbour's rooftops to reach your own. Inside, murals of bulls, leopards, and sometimes genitalia, a society where ritual and reproduction shared wall space. Scholars still debate, were these paintings fertility blessings or just decoration? But the fact remains, these were public homes, and these images weren't hidden. There's no evidence of separate sleeping quarters, no evidence of shame. Children were born and raised in these spaces. They saw everything, heard everything, which, depending on your modern sensibilities, sounds either nightmarish or refreshingly honest. Even the gods didn't demand discretion. In Mesopotamia, temples often doubled as centers of sexual ritual. The so-called sacred marriage involved a high priestess and a king, reenacting the divine union of Inanna and Dumuzi, witnessed, celebrated, institutionalized. In some cases, entire festivals centered around fertility rites. And no, they weren't performed behind curtains. In India, public art went further. The temples of Khajuraho, built between 950 and 1050 CE, are covered in carvings that would make modern tour guides sweat. Couples in contortionist embraces, orgies, voyeurism, bestiality even, not hidden inside, right there, on the outer walls, as if to say, before you enter the sacred space, remember what you are, flesh, breath, and wanting. These temples weren't adult theatres, they were spiritual epicenters, and yet, they made no attempt to hide the human body in its most primal state. Some scholars say the erotic carvings on the outer walls were symbolic. Leave your desires here, before entering the sanctum. Others say the opposite. That desire itself was a step toward enlightenment. Either way, the carvings were public, open to sun, to rain, and the judgment of 1,000 eyes, and no one sandblasted them away. Contrast that with modern museums, where ancient phallic amulets are labelled as fertility symbols, ancient statues with broken-off penises and politely averted gazes, history sanitized for your protection. As if acknowledging the sexual realities of the past might unmake the sophistication of the present, but the past had no such pretenses. In ancient Greece, gymnasiums were spaces for exercise, philosophy, and education. Also, they were naked. The word gymnos literally means nude. Boys and men trained together, oiled their bodies, wrestled, talked, and sometimes more. The erotic undercurrent wasn't an open secret, it was just open. Pederastic relationships, older men mentoring and often seducing younger boys, were formalized in some city-states. Philosophers wrote about it, artists painted it, and parents, many of them, approved. As part of elite education, Roman bathhouses worked the same way. Public, steamy, busy. Men and women bathed at different times, usually, but rules were often bent. In private rooms, transactions took place. A coin slipped under a towel. A glance exchanged across the steam. The bathhouse wasn't just a bathhouse. It was a marketplace for soap, gossip, politics, and sex, and nobody pretended otherwise. Even the layout of homes told the story. In Roman houses, the cubiculum, a bedroom, wasn't a sanctuary. It was just a side room. Doors didn't lock. Walls were thin. Guests could walk in. Servants. Your mother. Intimacy wasn't hidden. Just timed well. Japanese Shoen estates during the Heian period reflected this same openness. Aristocratic courtship played out in poems, slid through paper doors. But the architecture itself encouraged shared experience. Few summer panels, light, airy, fragile, didn't stop sound or shadow. Affairs were frequent, bedrooms optional. Real art was discretion without distance, knowing how to look away at the right moment or how to never speak of what you heard. Privacy, as we know it, is a modern invention, born from industrial cities, locked doors, and the illusion of individualism. The ancients had no such illusions. Or you didn't own your own space. You were part of a household, and households had rhythms, expectations, silences, indulgences. Or you didn't own your own space. You were part of a household, and households had rhythms, expectations. Medieval peasants shared straw mattresses in huts barely big enough for livestock. Newlyweds consummated marriages with witnesses in the room, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, with villagers listening from just outside. In noble courts, sex scandals unfolded like soap operas, maids as narrators, guards as reluctant accomplices. Lust didn't wait for privacy. It adapted to surveillance. Even punishment for public sex reveals how often it happened. In Islamic societies under early Sharia law, zina, or illicit sex, was punished harshly. But to prove zina, you needed 4 adult male witnesses to the actual act. Not just proximity, not just rumour. 4 men, seeing the same thing, at the same time, which meant zina was nearly impossible to prosecute unless the act was brazenly public. The law didn't assume privacy. It required audacity, and audacity wasn't in short supply. Take the festival of Floralia in ancient Rome, a celebration of spring and fertility. Prostitutes performed nude dances in the theatre. Spectators joined in. Garlands, games, and giggles. The line between civic duty and carnal delight blurred beneath the warm sun. The city didn't fall, it bloomed. We imagine the past as sexually repressed, cloaked in veils and decorum, but that's projection. The past wasn't modest, it was unsegmented. Desire wasn't quarantined to bedrooms or whispered behind hands. It was part of the day, part of the meal, part of the prayer, and part of the architecture. They didn't need locks, they didn't need doors, they didn't need shame, because nobody was pretending to be pure. Before shame, before locks, before love songs and law codes, there was an itch. Not metaphorical, not poetic, a literal maddening itch beneath the skin, a pull behind the belly, between the legs, at the base of the spine. The first humans didn't have words for it, just gestures, sounds. You don't need a language to feel arousal, you just need a body, and every body eventually itches. The anthropologists will call it mating behaviour, the biologists will mention pheromones, but that doesn't capture the awkwardness of the real thing. The glance that lingers too long, the accidental brush that wasn't, the fluttering confusion when someone smells like heat and smoke and food at the same time. The ancient world had no dating apps, but it had firelight and proximity. That was enough. In early human communities, hunter-gatherer bands wandering from coast to canopy, pairings weren't fixed, kinship lines were tangled. Anthropologist Margaret Mead argued that early societies probably didn't enforce strict monogamy. Sex, like food, was communal. You took what was shared, you gave what you could. Fidelity wasn't romantic, it was just inconvenient. Among the Kong people of the Kalahari, one of the most studied surviving hunter-gatherer groups, young people engage in sexual exploration freely. Pair bonds form, yes, but they are fluid, temporary. No one is shocked by nighttime visit or daytime flirtations, and while they live today, they offer a glimpse backward, a proxy for what the first itch may have looked like. Casual, curious, collective, but curiosity often outpaces comfort, especially when the body is young and the knowledge thin. Ancient medical texts tried to explain the itch in clinical terms. In the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest Egyptian medical documents, we find treatments for what they called excessive heat in the loins. Ingredients included crushed dates, honey, and powdered beetles. Applied where it tingled. Not quite science, but not nonsense either. The Greeks had their own theories. Hippocrates believed in the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Lust, he claimed, was a result of too much blood and heat. Women, in particular, were thought to be at risk of uterine suffocation, a terrifying and entirely fictional condition where the womb wandered the body, if not properly moistened by intercourse. Solution? Marriage, or, failing that, strategic penetration. Romantic. The Kama Sutra, compiled in India between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, takes a more practical approach. It opens not with positions or acrobatics, but with a discussion of what makes a good life. Dharma, artha, karma, duty, prosperity, pleasure. The itch, in other words, was acknowledged as essential, not indulgent, not shameful, just real. According to the text, men and women should learn the art of stimulation. Entire chapters on how to seduce, how to read signals, how to know when someone is ready. The suggestion is subtle, but radical. Desire is not just reactive, it is educable. You can teach someone how to want, you can learn how to be wanted. And yet, even the Kama Sutra is bounded. It assumes heterosexuality. It places men as pursuers and women as objects to be awakened. The itch is acknowledged, but gendered. Still, it's a far cry from the demonization that would follow in later centuries. In ancient China, Taoist texts viewed sex as a means of maintaining cosmic balance. The jing, or sexual essence, was vital to life. Men were taught to preserve their jing by delaying ejaculation. Women, in contrast, were seen as replenishing. The more pleasure they experienced, the more energy they passed on, which meant that women's orgasms were not only encouraged, they were medicinal. It was a system that required awareness, skill, mutual satisfaction. The itch wasn't just scratched, it was cultivated. But theory is one thing, life is another. What did the first itch feel like in practice? Probably like confusion. In adolescence, when bodies shift and boundaries blur, ancient societies varied wildly in their responses. Some created coming-of-age rituals, dramatic, dangerous, and often bloody. In Papua New Guinea, among the Sambia people, boys undergo a series of rites that include ritualized insemination by older males. It's not framed as abuse, though from a modern lens, it raises every alarm. It's framed as transmission, the transfer of strength, the first itch, institutionalized. Other societies opted for symbolism. Among the ancient Maya, puberty was marked by tooth filing and bloodletting, pain, transformation, fertility. The body altered to reflect its new urges. The itch wasn't denied, it was announced. In Greek mythology, desire always begins in chaos. Aphrodite is born from sea foam, fertilized by the severed genitals of Uranus. Eros, her child, shoots arrows that make mortals fall violently, in love or lust. The gods didn't suppress the itch, they embodied it. Zeus seduces or assaults anything with a pulse. Hera rages. Artemis flees. Dionysus revels. The myths weren't moral, they were explanatory. They said, this thing you feel, it's older than you, it's divine and dangerous. Dangerous, indeed, because the itch, when unreciprocated or misdirected, turns sour. Lust curdles into control. Myths of desire quickly bleed into myths of punishment. Actaeon glimpses Artemis bathing. He is turned into a stag and ripped apart by his own dogs. Echo loves Narcissus. He loves only his reflection. She fades into nothing but a voice. The first itch may be universal, but it was never harmless. By the time we reach the legal codes of early civilizations, the itch has become a threat. The Code of Hammurabi lists dozens of laws around sexual conduct, rape, adultery, incest, all categorized, weighed, punished. But these laws weren't about protection, they were about ownership. A daughter's virginity was her father's asset, a wife's fidelity, her husband's insurance policy. The itch wasn't criminal, it was inconvenient to men in power. Still, people itched and scratched. In Egyptian love poems, a girl waits on the riverbank, her sandals off, watching her lover cross the water. She calls him my lion, my desire. The language is lush, direct. There is no mention of marriage, no pretense of restraint, just the heat of anticipation. The body eager and unashamed. In Roman graffiti, the itch is less poetic. I screwed the barmaid. Her thighs could crush a donkey. Not exactly sonnets, but honest and urgent. Desire doesn't need elegance, it just needs an outlet. And when outlets were denied, by class, by gender, by custom, the itch found cracks. In medieval Europe, young peasants carved hearts into trees, left initials in secret corners of churches, slipped each other charms made of herbs and hair. It was never safe. A girl who gave in risked pregnancy, social ruin, or worse. A boy who pushed too far could be maimed, exiled, or killed. But the itch didn't care about consequences. It demanded friction, and so the body became both battlefield and bargaining chip. A girl might let him touch her breast, but only if he swore he'd marry her. A boy might whisper promises into the dark, knowing he'd never repeat them in daylight. The itch turned children into schemers, poets, liars, and lovers. Always, it returns. The first itch, not love, not even lust, just the baseline throb of being alive in a body that wants. You feel it in the heat of summer, when skin touches skin for too long. You feel it in the silence between words. You feel it when history tries to look away, but the stone carvings stare back. They itch too, and like you, they didn't always know what to do with it. Before you ever whispered something forbidden into the dark, the gods had already done it. Before lovers locked eyes across a fire, or risked scandal for a touch, the divine had already seduced, stolen, transformed, and devoured. Humanity didn't invent desire, it inherited it. And the gods, conveniently, never asked permission. In almost every mythology, sex doesn't appear gently. It arrives with thunder, it breaks the sky open. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Inanna does not flirt, she demands. She strides into her lover Dumuzi's fields and calls him a wild bull. She describes her vulva like it's a holy temple, and his penis like a plough sent by the heavens. They don't exchange sonnets, they collide like storms. Their union isn't just sanctioned, it's sacred. Fertility rituals reenacted it every year, publicly, with temple priestesses and kings. Desire wasn't blasphemy, it was ritual. But desire in the hands of gods was never safe, because gods didn't follow rules, they made them. Take Zeus, the Greek king of gods, whose libido outpaced any mortal's patience. He pursued nymphs, queens, and young boys alike. He took the form of a swan to seduce or assault Leda, a bull to carry off Europa, a shower of gold to infiltrate Danae's chamber. The Greeks didn't blink, the divine had needs, and mortals were, at best, distractions, at worst, consequences. The problem wasn't Zeus, it was being seen by him. If a mortal caught the eye of a god, it was usually the end of their peace. Some were rewarded, others turned into trees, bears, echoes. These stories weren't just legends, they were blueprints, explanations, warnings. What do you do with a desire so powerful it unravels the sky? You name it divine. In Egypt, the gods didn't need euphemisms. Creation itself began with a god masturbating into the void. Atum, the creator deity, brought life through ejaculation. His semen became air and moisture, Shu and Tefnut. Later, gods like Osiris were chopped into pieces by jealous brothers. His penis, swallowed by a fish, was the only part never recovered. So his wife Isis built a new one, magically, then rode it, then conceived Horus. If this sounds strange, it's because it is, but to the Egyptians, it wasn't pornography, it was theology. Life comes from sex, even when death intervenes. The gods bleed, and want, and grieve, just like people, but they also resurrect, remold, climax the universe back into shape. These weren't metaphors, they were instructions. So temples were not quiet. They echoed with hymns that sounded like courtship. In the love poetry of the New Kingdom, men called women my lotus, and women replied, my intoxication is from seeing you. These poems were offered to Hathor, goddess of love and drunkenness, whose festivals were not known for moderation. At her gatherings, drinking was encouraged, dancing was ecstatic, and inhibitions fell like grain in the wind, because if the gods desired, how could you not? Desire wasn't the sin, forgetting it maybe. In India, gods also arrived with arousal already built in. Krishna, a divine avatar, flirted with cowherd girls. The gopis, in a dance that blurred the line between devotion and seduction. He multiplies himself so that each girl thinks she is alone with him. They sing, they dance, they sweat in the moonlight, and their love is called bhakti, devotion. Not lust, not blasphemy, just a deeper kind of hunger, the kind that leads not to sin, but to liberation. The Bhagavata Purana doesn't describe this union with shame. It describes it with longing. The soul yearns for the divine, like a lover for a lost embrace. This wasn't metaphor, it was practice. Mystics meditated on Krishna's body, his lips, his touch. Erotic imagery became the path to transcendence. And for many, it still is. Tantric traditions took this further. They saw sexual energy as the most potent form of spiritual power. Kundalini, the coiled serpent at the base of the spine, could be awakened through union, literal or symbolic. Male and female energies, Shiva and Shakti, were seen as complements. Together, they didn't just reproduce, they recreated the cosmos, again and again, and this wasn't hidden in caves. It was carved onto the walls of temples. The Khajuraho complex stands as the most unapologetic portfolio of divine sexuality. Gods and mortals, locked in every conceivable position, no shame, no censorship, just stone, sun, and eternity. Compare that to the Hebrew Bible. Here, desire is treated with ambivalence. It exists, of course it does, but it's dangerous. Eve eats the fruit. Bathsheba bathes on the rooftop. Lot's daughters seduce their father. Samson falls for Delilah. Over and over, women are painted as the catalyst, men as the fallen, and God watches. The Song of Songs, however, is the exception. A love poem nestled between war and law. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. It's intimate, lush, physical. Some scholars argue it's about the love between God and Israel. Others say it's just two people, drunk on each other. Either way, it's there, canonized. Proof that even in the most controlled religious narratives, the body still hums under the parchment. In Mesoamerica, gods didn't need to hide either. Mayan gods like Itzamar Na and Ixcal governed both medicine and fertility. Creation myths often involved bloodletting, intercourse, and sacrifice, all braided together. There wasn't a clean line between desire and death. The gods made the world with pain and pleasure side by side. Human rituals mirrored this. Puberty rites involved piercings, tattoos, and symbolic unions with deities. To grow up was to feel the itch and to offer it to the sky. In Japan, Shinto myths also played with lust. The goddess Amaterasu hides in a cave, and the world goes dark. To lure her out, the goddess Uzume performs a lewd dance. Stripping, laughing, stomping. The gods cheer. Amaterasu peaks. Light returns. The moral, even the sun responds to desire. Even divinity needs a show. What unites all these myths is not just sex, but the consequences of it. Desire births the world, but it also ends it. Take the Norse god Loki. He seduces, shapeshifts, and sows chaos. Once, he even turns into a mare, mates with a stallion, and gives birth to an 8-legged horse. There's no moral here, just the strange, sticky truth that gods, like people, can't resist the pull, and when they give in, things happen. Unpredictable, irreversible things. This is where theology meets anthropology. If the gods do it, it must be important. If the gods suffer for it, it must be powerful. And if the gods get away with it, maybe, just maybe, you will too. So temples carved it into stone, priests read it from scrolls, artists painted it in gold leaf and lapis lazuli. Desire was divine, but never innocent, because gods do not ask, they act, and mortals learn to call it holy. Desire is one thing, permission is another, and for most of human history, the line between the two has been muddy, crossed, erased, or simply never drawn. Can I touch you is a question that assumes modernity. It assumes rights. It assumes privacy. But for most of the ancient world, the answer didn't depend on feeling. It depended on ownership, status, and timing. Touch wasn't a right you asked for. It was a privilege you controlled or lost. In the earliest legal systems, consent as we understand it didn't exist. What mattered was who you belonged to. In the Code of Hammurabi, written in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago, a woman caught in adultery was drowned, regardless of whether she said yes, no, or nothing at all. The man, sometimes punished, sometimes not. It depended on whether the woman was married, not whether she agreed. Consent was less about a woman's voice and more about a man's property. In ancient Rome, the term stuprum referred to illicit sexual behaviour, but what counted as illicit depended on social rank. A freeborn Roman woman could cry rape only under specific conditions. Slaves, by contrast, couldn't say no. Their bodies weren't their own. A master had every right to use them. No law questioned this. No god intervened. And yet, desire persisted alongside violence, which means people still found ways to say yes and to say no, even without being asked. In ancient India, the Kama Sutra doesn't just detail technique, it outlines gestures, non-verbal cues of interest or refusal, a woman biting her lower lip, a man adjusting his robe, the way someone lingered when passing a cup. These weren't just flirtations, they were negotiations, unspoken contracts of curiosity and caution. Courtship was slow, deliberate, symbolic. A man might leave a garland at a woman's door, she might respond with one of her own, or not. Eyes meant something, so did silence. Consent didn't always need to be spoken, it needed to be read. In early Chinese dynasties, similar rituals emerged, a hairpin given, a sleeve brushed. In Confucian ethics, modesty was paramount. A woman's virtue was her currency. Men who approached too eagerly, considered vulgar. But beneath that restraint was a game of signs, night visits arranged by candlelight. A closed curtain meant not tonight. An open one meant proceed. Still, the line remained thin. In many cultures, a woman's no could be interpreted as a performance, meant to preserve her reputation, rather than express true refusal. And this opened the door to endless abuses. Because if no could mean yes, then what did yes even mean? Marriage, of course, overrode it all. In most ancient societies, a married woman had no legal grounds to refuse her husband. In biblical texts, a wife's body belongs to her husband. The Apostle Paul writes, "The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does." It is rarely quoted in full. The next line gives the husband's body to the wife, but the damage is done. The idea that marriage equals access has echoed for millennia, and yet, again, people pushed back. In medieval Islamic law, marriage contracts included stipulations. A bride could set terms. She could demand space, money, time. While sexual availability was expected, forced sex within marriage was debated. Scholars argued over what counted as harm. Some said pain invalidated consent. Others said consent wasn't needed. The question lingered. Not can I touch you, but how much can you tolerate? Among the Greeks, the word eros described passionate desire, but not necessarily mutual. The god Eros shoots arrows. The target has no say. Myths are full of abductions. Persephone, Daphne, Europa. Love, in these stories, is something done to you. The victim is transformed, married, or silenced. It isn't romantic, it's precedent. But there were moments, slim, golden moments, when permission was real. In Egyptian love poems, the voice often belongs to the woman. She invites, she teases, she dreams of her lover's approach. He is coming. I hear his footsteps, one writes. These are not warnings, they are welcomes. Here, at least, desire flows both ways. In Japanese heian courtship, men would sneak into the homes of women they admired. leaving poems or gifts. If the woman was interested, she might write back. If not, she might ignore him, or humiliate him with a sharper verse. But even here, the balance was fragile. A persistent suitor wasn't always punished, and refusal could bring more danger than acceptance. Among the Norse, saga heroines were more vocal. Some declared their desires openly, others rejected suitors with poetic insults. Shield maidens like Brynhild demanded respect before touch. Their stories weren't always happy, but they made space for no. Still, across most of history, the question "can I touch you?" was less about empathy and more about timing. If you were poor, a woman, a slave, or simply in the wrong place, your body was negotiable, or not even that. It was already spoken for. What does that do to a person? To live in a world where your own skin isn't yours, where touch isn't an offer, but a transaction. It makes you quiet. It makes you clever. It makes you find ways to control the uncontrollable. In some African societies, girls were taught specific dances to attract lovers, not to provoke, but to signal. In the Polynesian islands, young couples met in love huts, small structures away from the village where they could experiment without shame. These were not dens of sin, they were spaces of autonomy, a chance, however brief, to say yes on your own terms. And when people couldn't say no, they rebelled in other ways. A slave might fake illness, a wife might feign ritual purity, a concubine might learn when to disappear. Resistance wasn't always loud, but it was constant. In medieval Europe, courtly love literature introduced the idea that a woman's affection had to be earned. A knight suffered for her favour. He waited, he begged, he wept. It was theatre, but it shifted the narrative. Suddenly, women were not just prizes, they were choosers, at least in fiction. Reality, of course, was rougher. Peasant girls married young, their choices limited. A village flirtation could turn into an unwanted pregnancy, a broken engagement, a ruined life. And yet, even here, touches were exchanged in haylofts and behind churches. Some wanted it, some didn't. Most had no choice but to pretend they did. In the Mayan codices, courtship rituals involved gift-giving and ritual dancing. Consent was assumed once certain steps were taken, but women still had ways of expressing disapproval, through clothing, through posture, through silence. Not legal refusal, just cultural code. And that's the thread, isn't it? Consent didn't vanish. It simply changed form. It lived in gestures, in glances, in refusal by delay, in acceptance by ritual. It lived wherever someone still had enough power to say no and enough hope to say yes. Today, we imagine consent as clear, contractual, unambiguous. But history isn't clean. It's crowded, noisy, scared. Most people didn't ask. They assumed. Most people didn't speak. They hinted, and the consequences fell, again and again, on those with the least protection. So when we ask, "Can I touch you?" we aren't just being polite. We are reaching backward, undoing damage, naming ghosts, and maybe, finally, listening for an answer. Desire was everywhere, and that made it dangerous, because hunger without control unsettles empires, makes fools of kings, unravels lineages. So the solution was simple: marry them. Quickly, early, often, and with as many strings attached as possible. Marriage in the ancient world wasn't a romantic destination. It was a fire extinguisher, a social straitjacket, a way to bind lust before it could become chaos. You weren't told to fall in love. You were told when the ceremony would happen, what dowry was owed, and which gods to thank. The rest, immaterial. The Greeks saw it as a necessity, not a pleasure. Athenian girls were married off by their fathers, often before their first period, 14, 13, sometimes younger, usually twice her age, more stable, less impulsive, a man who supposedly knew what to do with the responsibility of a bride who still played with dolls. In Rome, they weren't far behind. Legally, girls could marry at 12, boys at 14, and while not every union happened that young, the point was clear: desire was a liability if left uncontained. Puberty didn't mean freedom, it meant contracts, signatures, property transferred. A girl's body moved from father to husband, just as cleanly as land or cattle. What she wanted, rarely asked. Ancient India codified it in verses. The Manusmriti, a legal and moral guidebook, dictated the ideal ages: 8 to 12 for a girl, and the reason was explicit. A girl should be married before she menstruates, or her family will be cursed. Biology became urgency, a ticking clock, where as soon as the itch arrived, the answer was marriage. It wasn't unique. In Jewish law too, early marriage was encouraged. My Pleikel law called a Nutoildschenwerk Palamerk. Aptionaverektek speak of betrothals by age 12 and a half. The logic? Better in a home, under a man's supervision, than outside where temptation lurked. The underlying assumption in all of this was fear. Fear that girls might like it, that they might want someone not chosen for them. Fear that desire, if left unclaimed, would rot the structure from the inside. So they sealed it in ritual. Weddings were often grand, but they weren't designed for joy. They were formal transfers of ownership. In ancient Mesopotamia, the bride price paid by the groom's family to the brides was a public record, not a gesture, an invoice. And once paid, the girl moved in. Her duties spelled out: manage the home, bear children, don't stray. In Egypt, things were slightly looser. Marriage contracts from the New Kingdom show women retained some rights. They could own property. Divorce was possible, but still, the pairing was urgent. Men married young women to ensure heirs. Women married older men to ensure protection. And the gods, well, the gods were already watching. Even divine stories reinforce the need to marry fast. In Greek myth, Persephone is abducted by Hades and married in the underworld before her mother even notices she's missing. No courting, no negotiation, just a decision made by men, one mortal, one god, while the girl picks flowers. In China, Confucianism turned marriage into a pillar of social stability. A man without a wife was seen as incomplete. A woman without a husband was a threat to order. Matchmakers weren't there to find love. They were there to prevent scandal. Marriage became math. Astrological charts aligned, birth dates matched, fortunes read, and if the signs were favourable, a wedding followed. Sometimes without the couple meeting beforehand, because love was unpredictable, and unpredictability had no place in empire. Among the Mayans, marriage was arranged by family members, often through professional negotiators. The process involved gifts, visits, and omens. But once agreed upon, the marriage was swift. No long engagements, no late-night serenades, just ritual, feast, and obligation. Girls were often 12 or 13, boys slightly older, and while the ceremonies varied, the urgency never did. In medieval Europe, the church eventually imposed age restrictions. Marriage without consent under a certain age was discouraged, but not prohibited. Nobles married off daughters at 10 or 11 to secure alliances. Royalty did it younger. The physical consummation might be delayed until puberty, but the legal bond, sealed early. Desire could wait, but the paperwork couldn't, because marriage wasn't about passion, it was about control. Control of property, of fertility, of behaviour. The assumption was, once married, the dangerous edge of desire dulled, that putting a ring on the finger also closed the legs. But of course, it didn't. People cheated, snuck around, visited bathhouses, fell in love with others, and every law code, Babylonian, Roman, Christian, developed a chapter on adultery because of it. But still, they clung to the idea, marry them early, and they won't stray. It was fantasy, but a deeply institutionalized one, and for women, the cost was high. Early marriage meant early childbirth, and often early death. Girls too small to deliver safely, too young to endure the trauma. Maternal mortality wasn't a tragedy, it was an expectation, something whispered in every home. If she lives, we rejoice. If she dies, we try again. And yet, the urgency never slowed, because the alternative was worse, at least to them. An unmarried girl was a scandal waiting to happen, an unclaimed womb, a door left open. So they closed it fast, with rituals, with songs, with dowries, and with fear. But sometimes people resisted. In ancient Sparta, women married later, around 18. The state wanted strong mothers, athletic ones. Girls were encouraged to train, to build muscle, to delay marriage until their bodies were ready. It wasn't progressive, but it was practical. And for once, the urgency paused. In Japan's Heian period, aristocratic women could reject suitors. Courtship involved poetry, exchanges, long observation. A woman might wait, delay, decline. Marriage was still expected, but not forced with the same speed. in rare cases, women opted out entirely. The Vestal virgins of Rome swore celibacy in exchange for prestige. They were chosen young, served for 30 years, and held power most Roman women could only dream of. Their chastity was sacred, but also strategic, an escape from the urgency of marriage. A kind of loophole. But for most, there was no exit. Marriage came with the first sign of blood, or before, and it wasn't just expected, it was enforced. The pressure wasn't only external, it crept into language, into lullabies, into the way mothers spoke to daughters. One day, your husband will, became prophecy. Dreaming of anything else felt dangerous, and desire, if not channeled into a ring and a name, became something else entirely, something sinful or mad. So they married, not because they wanted to, but because they were told to, because hunger is frightening, and nothing calms a frightened society like a wedding. Before the creak of a bed frame, before the gasp behind a locked door, before the final yes, there was the build-up. And in the ancient world, the build-up was everything, because the bedroom, when it came, was rarely private, and often perfunctory. What mattered more was what led up to it. The rituals, the choreography, the flirtations laced with danger. The anticipation wasn't a luxury, it was survival, a way to gauge safety, to delay disaster, to play the game without tipping the board, because once you reached the bed, your choice often vanished. So people lingered in the before. In ancient India, the Kama Sutra is famous for what happens behind closed doors, but it spends just as much time on the approach. A proper lover, it says, must learn to read moods, to prepare the setting, to understand scent, sound, texture. Seduction starts with conversation, then glances, then touch, delicate, strategic, timed. A scratch here, a bite there, not for dominance, but for rhythm. Seduction was not a chase, it was a study, and it wasn't just for men, women too were taught the art. How to apply perfumes, how to dress with just enough asymmetry to be interesting, how to feign disinterest, then pull attention back like a net. The bedroom wasn't the goal, it was the eventual result of a much more complex performance. In Japan's Heian era, the foreplay lasted for weeks. Aristocrats wrote poetry back and forth, hundreds of verses, folded into silk, perfumed, hand-delivered under moonlight. A single poem could mean everything, or nothing, a comma, a twist in metaphor, a hidden reference to a dream shared years ago. Love letters were puzzles. If a man showed up too early, physically or emotionally, he lost. If he waited too long, someone else's poem slipped under the screen first. The bedroom only opened once the performance was complete. In the Islamic Golden Age, erotic literature thrived. Books like The Perfumed Garden or The Encyclopedia of Pleasure catalogued not only positions, but also the emotional preparation. The ideal lover had to know how to bathe, how to speak gently, how to dress with intention. A man was judged, not by his conquest, but by his patience. In fact, quickness was seen as a kind of incompetence, because what was the point of entering the bedroom if you didn't earn it? Egyptians, too, understood this rhythm. In love poems, women speak of sneaking glances at their beloved across canals, of waiting for the festival to catch his eye, of leaving flowers or sashes where he might find them. These gestures weren't subtle out of modesty. They were subtle because desire, to be satisfying, needed space to stretch. Even in ancient Greece, where sex was often transactional, the rituals still mattered. At symposiums, exclusive drinking parties, heterae or high-class courtesans would entertain the men with music, conversation, and teasing. They were educated, artful. They might play coy, or bold, or distant, depending on the client. The seduction wasn't about stripping, it was about creating a moment, making the man feel chosen, even if his coin said otherwise. In Rome, flirtation happened in the forum, in the bathhouse, in the atrium of a friend's home. Romans loved spectacle, so seduction became theatre, perfumes imported from Arabia, garments dyed in rare colours. Subtle gestures, like toying with a necklace or adjusting a sandal strap, became coded language. You didn't ask directly, you hinted, and hoped the hint was caught, because once the invitation was spoken aloud, it couldn't be unsaid. So everything remained just suggestive enough to maintain deniability. In medieval Europe, where the church policed the body with prayers and threats, the rituals went underground. Lovers carved symbols into trees, exchanged tokens, ribbons, bits of lace, pressed flowers. They met behind churches, in fields, in corners of markets. The poems they whispered were disguised as psalms. The touches they stole explained as accidents. But they understood the game. Desire lived in the before, because after meant consequences. Even in the strictest cultures, rituals of seduction found their way in. In early China, women could express interest through embroidery. A certain bird stitched into a robe, a flower pattern on a handkerchief. Entire courtships happened across balconies and silk screens. Families watched closely. So lovers invented a new language, one of colour, pattern, timing. And yet, all of this was done with one goal, to make the eventual bedroom feel like choice, not obligation. Because most of the time, sex came without preamble. A marriage arranged by parents, a debt paid with flesh, a command from a superior. The majority of people throughout history didn't get build-up. They got duty, or fear, or silence. So the before, the real before, became a kind of rebellion, a way to insert humanity into a transaction. In brothels, this was amplified. Courtesans and prostitutes didn't just offer bodies, they offered illusions. They learned their clients' preferences, their wounds, their rhythms. A good courtesan could keep a man coming back, not for the act, but for the feeling of being wanted. It wasn't real, but it was rehearsed. And sometimes that was enough. In sacred sex rites, like those practiced in parts of Mesopotamia, the build-up was ceremonial. The union between the priestess and king represented divine copulation, but it required days of fasting, bathing, perfuming, incantations. The act was ritual, choreographed. Every movement meant something. The body didn't just arrive, it was prepared like an offering. And then there were the potions. Aphrodisiacs were everywhere. Mandrake root in the Mediterranean, ginseng in East Asia, saffron and cinnamon, and powdered beetle shells. Some worked, most didn't. But it wasn't about effectiveness. It was about belief. The idea that desire could be summoned, that readiness could be coaxed, because not everybody wanted at the same time. And so, people looked for help. Not just to become aroused, but to make the other person feel something first. Which says more than we think. It says that, despite everything, laws, contracts, force, people still hoped for a moment of connection, a flicker of realness before the inevitability, a second of yes before the expected act. Even when choice was thin, people reached for ritual, a pause, a poem, a scent, a look, because the bedroom wasn't where the story started, it was where it ended, and everything that came before was the only part they could make their own. You can't legislate desire, but that's never stopped anyone from trying to bottle it. Across centuries and continents, humans have whispered to roots, crushed strange herbs, stirred powders into wine, and convinced themselves that lust could be summoned like a loyal servant. If it didn't come naturally, if age or fear or boredom dulled the edge, then something could be brewed, something ancient, mysterious, slightly dangerous, a remedy for the body, but mostly for the ego. Because if the fire flickers, surely someone, somewhere, must have found a way to stoke it. And so began the global obsession with aphrodisiacs. The ancient Egyptians weren't subtle about it. In the Ebers and Kahun scrolls, we find recipes for inciting passion, dates and honey mashed together, onion juice, lettuce believed to be the favourite of Min, god of fertility, whose statues often featured a very prominent erection. Lettuce grew upright, therefore it must do the same for a man. The logic wasn't scientific, but it was deeply hopeful. The Greeks added refinement. They worshipped Eros, yes, but they also believed in chemistry, literally. Animal parts, herbs, minerals, sea urchins, hippo fat. But most prized was Satyrion, a now extinct orchid whose root resembled male genitals. Dioscorides called it stimulating to the loins. Pliny the Elder claimed that even goats, after eating it, became uncontrollably lustful, which, admittedly, sounds redundant. It wasn't always appetizing. In Rome, a remedy for female frigidity involved smearing goose fat mixed with crushed beetles on the thighs. Not because it smelled nice, but because desperation often overrides dignity. The Romans also favoured oysters, cold, wet, slippery, consumed raw, Aphrodite was born from the sea, they reasoned, so perhaps her magic lingered in the shellfish. This association would echo through centuries. Casanova himself reportedly ate 50 oysters for breakfast, alone. In India, the approach was more spiritual. The Kama Sutra devotes entire sections to potions and unguents meant to rouse passion, not just for intercourse, but for presence, charm, magnetism. Mixtures of ghee, honey, sesame oil, and powdered roots, some to be consumed, others rubbed into the skin, and others, well, inserted. The goal was balance, stimulating both the body and the subtle energies, the ojas and prana. Tantric texts went further. Sexual fluids were sacred, transformational. The union of Shiva and Shakti was not just philosophical, it was literal. Some sects practiced ritual ingestion of sexual fluids, believing that to consume the essence of another was to absorb their power. It was alchemy, not lust, though if you're swallowing your lover's essence on purpose, the distinction gets blurry. In China, the search for aphrodisiacs intersected with Taoist medicine. Sexual energy, or jing, was life force. To lose it carelessly, especially through ejaculation, was to weaken the body, but to build it, to cultivate it, that was power. Deer antler, tiger penis, ginseng, rhino horn, consumed not for chemistry, but for symbolism. The deer is fertile, the tiger is fierce. Eat it, become it. And so men ground these ingredients into powder, boiled them in soups, paid small fortunes to smugglers. Modern science would later debunk most of it, but belief is a powerful stimulant. Maybe the potion didn't work, but maybe the confidence did. Women too were given mixtures, often gentler, rose water, musk oil, sometimes more aggressive, cantharides or Spanish fly, derived from blister beetles, was believed to increase arousal by irritating the genitals. It worked, painfully, and sometimes fatally. But if a man was desperate and a woman was hesitant, a few drops in her wine might be enough to blur the lines. That too is part of the history. Potions weren't always shared in love. Sometimes they were slipped into drinks, used to coax consent that was never given, to simulate desire that didn't exist. Aphrodisiacs walk a knife's edge between seduction. In medieval Europe, love potions took on a new role. Christian doctrine frowned upon lust, but it couldn't eliminate it. So people took matters into their own kitchens. Mandrake root, a plant that screams when uprooted and looks disturbingly humanoid, was brewed into infusions. It was thought to cause hallucinations, fever, erotic dreams, perfect for breaking a vow of chastity, with plausible deniability. Witches, midwives, cunning folk, passed down recipes, herbs like damiana, yohimbe bark, vervain, incenses burned, charms worn close to the skin. If a man's affection cooled, his lover might leave a mixture of menstrual blood and red wine under his bed. Not because it smelled good, but because folklore said it bound him by the gut, and if that failed, there were still more options. In West African traditions, roots like nuklu or ogbono were chewed before lovemaking. Some tribes believed a woman could make herself irresistible by bathing in river water collected at dawn, mixed with certain flowers. Desire wasn't mechanical, it was spiritual, something coaxed from the world through ritual, not forced from a bottle. Among the Aztecs, chocolate was divine, not the sugary confection, but bitter, spiced, liquid. Warriors drank it before battle, lovers drank it before other kinds of war. Montezuma was said to consume goblets daily, sometimes with chili, not just for energy, for power, for allure. And it wasn't only ingested, it was painted. Egyptian women applied perfumes to inner thighs, behind the ears, under the breasts. Greek women rubbed scented oils along arms and necks. The smell wasn't random, it was signal, to stir something before a word was even spoken. Perfume itself was born from this logic. In Arabic cultures, oud and musk were used not just to smell pleasant, but to mark presence. A woman's scent lingered in a room long after she left. A man's robe carried the perfume of his companion. In a world without photographs, scent was the memory. Even the placement mattered. A dab on the collarbone, availability, a drop on the wrist, invitation, behind the knee, intimacy. But sometimes, the most powerful aphrodisiac wasn't a potion at all, it was illusion. Confidence stirred by a sip of something ancient, belief in a root, a spell, a flower. Sometimes the potion did nothing, but the drinker, convinced of its power, did the rest. Because the real alchemy was always psychological. A man who believes he is irresistible moves differently. A woman who believes her scent draws eyes becomes magnetic. And in a world that rarely gave people agency over their own desire, a vial of powder or oil was sometimes the only tool they had. A lie, not to control another, but to feel worthy of wanting and being wanted. So they brewed and drank and anointed themselves in hope, because the heart may flutter, but the body sometimes needs convincing. Marriage was sacred, public, patrolled, but people were human long before they were husbands and wives. And so, for every ceremony blessed by priests and scribes, there were 10 quiet moments stolen behind markets, between shifts, beneath the stars. Because even in civilizations built on rules, desire didn't wait for paperwork. It ducked under the altar, climbed through windows, found the spaces where no one was watching, or at least where everyone agreed to look away. Call it what you want: infidelity, dalliance, release. But it wasn't always betrayal. Sometimes it was just survival, or boredom, or something older than either. Not everyone could afford marriage. In ancient Mesopotamia, a formal union meant bride price, dowries, contracts, witnesses, but sex, that was free, or negotiable. In the Hammurabi Code, a man could take a lover without penalty, as long as she wasn't someone else's wife. The law didn't care if feelings got hurt. It cared who got pregnant, and what it would do to the inheritance. For women, it was more complicated. A married woman caught in a fling could be drowned, exiled, strangled. An unmarried woman, technically available, socially dangerous. Her virtue was currency, her reputation brittle. One rumor could sink an entire household. So people got creative. In Egypt, concubinage was common, not illegal, not quite respected either. A man might take a secondary partner, usually from a lower class, without formal marriage. She might live in the house, bear children, even be loved, but she wasn't a wife. She couldn't inherit. Still, the arrangement offered stability for some, and pleasure for others. Love, when it came, was optional. Roman citizens turned casual flings into a system. Amicae, concubinae. The difference wasn't emotional, it was contractual. A concubine had no dowry, no wedding, no ceremony, but she had a place, a role, and often a room. Cato the Elder famously advised young men to visit prostitutes regularly. Better that, he said, than risk corrupting someone's daughter. The body, to the Roman state, was a public good, so long as you followed the correct channels, and they had channels. Bathhouses, temples, brothels licensed by the empire, streets where women wore togas instead of stolas. A quiet signal that they were available, for a price. Sex wasn't shameful, it was expected. The trick was discretion. In Pompeii, graffiti on brothel walls advertised services, prices, specialties. I screwed the barmaid. Fortunata was here. Success, the weaver, is hot stuff. Desire wasn't hidden, it was scribbled into public memory. In ancient India, the line between sacred and sensual blurred often. The Kama Sutra doesn't condemn casual intimacy. It outlines it: how to seduce a stranger, how to end an affair without offence, how to engage with a woman too shy to admit what she wants. Courtesans, Garnicus, were trained not only in sex, but in music, poetry, conversation. Their companionship was cultivated and temporary. They were not wives, but they were chosen. Some courtesans became powerful. They negotiated with kings, owned property, rejected clients, and yet their status remained uncertain. Celebrated in life, forgotten in death. No statues, no lineages, no official ring. China too had its distinctions. Wives were for heirs, concubines were for pleasure, or politics. Elite men kept harems, sometimes dozens of women, ranked in order of favour. The empress might be first, but her influence depended on childbirth. A concubine who bore a son could rise, one who didn't, forgotten. But even these unofficial women were guarded, forbidden to others. Their flings, if discovered, were punished as treason. But not everyone lived in palaces. In rural villages, love was less regulated. A boy and a girl might meet during a festival, share wine, sneak into the fields, maybe once. maybe for years. No ring, still a fling. Sometimes they married later. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were caught. In medieval Europe, church law forbade sex outside marriage, but human law struggled to keep up. Peasants confessed to fornication regularly. Fines were issued, whippings occasionally, but most of the time it was tolerated, if quietly, as long as it didn't cause scandal or pregnancy or lawsuits. Still, lovers found each other behind barns, beneath church pews, in letters exchanged under loaves of bread. The desire wasn't new, just inconvenient. Among the Vikings, casual sex was less stigmatized, at least for men. Women were expected to remain chaste. Men, less so. But even here, double standards thrived. A woman caught in bed with a man not her husband might be killed. A man caught with another man's wife, fined. Civilization always finds a way to monetize desire. In Japan's Edo period, male samurai were expected to marry, have children, maintain discipline. But love between men, especially older samurai and younger apprentices, was culturally accepted. These were not seen as flings. They were bonds. Emotional, physical, temporary. Not marriage, but not meaningless. Meanwhile, the courtesans of the pleasure quarters wrote poetry about lost lovers and moonlit nights. They weren't wives, but their hearts broke just the same. The Mesoamerican world had its own rules. Among the Maya, unmarried sexual activity wasn't unusual, so long as it didn't disrupt the social order. Girls might be betrothed early, but before that, flings happened during festivals. Boys wore masks, girls sang songs. Sometimes, hands met in the dark. The elders looked away. Unless someone got pregnant, then marriage or punishment. In African traditions, some tribes practiced trial marriages. A man and woman might live together before deciding to wed. Others had polygynous systems where flings outside the primary wife were expected, but still bounded by rules, because even freedom needs structure, and even flings follow patterns. First, the glance, then the message, then the risk, then the lie. You tell yourself just once, or they understand, or it's not love, or it is. You think the absence of a ring makes it easier. It doesn't. It just makes the ending blurrier, because flings rarely stay casual. They gather weight, memory, expectations. They aren't designed to last, but they do leave something behind. A perfume in the air, a song you can't listen to anymore, a name you say too quickly, too often, too softly. History is full of rings, but it's even fuller of the spaces in between. The hand that was held without permission, the letter never sent, the promise made under moonlight with no intention of keeping it. They don't put those stories on scrolls, but they're the ones that survive. They smiled politely at each other in the market. Their fingers brushed as they exchanged coins. 1 second, maybe less, but it was enough. Enough to make a neighbour pause. Enough to make a rumour grow teeth. In almost every ancient society, touching in public was an act loaded with meaning. Not because people weren't doing it, but because everyone knew they were, and because the line between innocent and indecent was drawn in chalk. One wrong gust, and you were scandal. Public desire, spoken, acted, or merely hinted, was dangerous. Not because it didn't happen, but because it refused to stay invisible. The earliest laws weren't about preventing sex, they were about containing it, channeling it into sanctioned categories: marriage, prostitution, sacred rites. Anything else, especially when performed in public, became threat. But people touched anyway. In Roman cities, public affection was policed not just by law, but by expectation. Roman men prided themselves on restraint. To kiss your wife in the street? Gosh, a sign of poor breeding. To display emotion? To lose face? But behind the walls of bathhouses, behind columns at festivals, rules slipped. The poet Ovid, patron saint of erotic chaos, wrote manuals for seduction in crowded spaces. Find her at the races, he advised. Brush against her arm as the crowd surges. It was the oldest trick in the book, and it was in the book. He even suggested pretending to adjust a girl's shawl while stealing a kiss. Subtlety, it seemed, was an art form, but only for some. In Pompeii, couples carved names into walls. Vibius loves Julia. Myrtis gave herself to Secundus here. not declarations of love, announcements, of availability, of conquest, public, proud, and depending on who saw it, provocative. In ancient India, public displays of affection were context-dependent. Within the privacy of home or temple, desire was honoured. In the open street, different story. The Manusmriti, a Sanskrit legal text, discouraged overt displays. Women were instructed to keep their gazes low, their gestures modest. A smile held too long could be interpreted as invitation. A glance too direct could bring consequences. But the Kama Sutra, that famous counterbalance, offered tactics for stolen moments. How to whisper compliments at a gathering, how to make eye contact at festivals, how to initiate touch beneath the folds of a sari. Desire was still there, it just knew how to duck. In China, Confucian decorum dictated emotional reserve. Men and women were not to sit too closely. Touching, especially in public, was discouraged as improper. A wife walking beside her husband kept her eyes averted. Even hand-holding was considered suspect. But within these restrictions, people improvised. A flick of the sleeve, a shared teacup, a pause at the doorway. When space became language, touch became poetry. But it was also surveillance. A woman who smiled too often, who lingered too long, might find herself accused of what, exactly, didn't always matter. The accusation was its own punishment. In Islamic societies, modesty was both law and virtue. Haya, shame, was considered a moral strength. Unrelated men and women were not to be alone together. Physical touch, even incidental, was to be avoided. But the heart doesn't always follow instruction. So again, desire moved in the shadows. Letters passed through children. Rings returned with messages carved on the inside. Love grew in courtyards and across balconies. No kisses, no embraces, but footprints in sand. Glances through latticework. That strange ache of knowing someone's routine better than your own. The body remained untouched, but the heart never got the memo. In Japan's Edo period, public affection was rare among the aristocracy. But in the ukiyo, the floating world of pleasure districts, touch was currency. Courtesans entertained openly. Performances blended eroticism with theatre. Yet even there, affection was transactional. A touch meant money. A kiss, status. True intimacy, if it ever came, had to hide behind the performance. Among commoners, flirtation happened during festivals, dances, games, shared drinks. Temporary spaces where rules were loosened but not erased. A hand placed too long, a laugh too loud. Someone always watching, always ready to tell. Because the real fear wasn't the act, it was the spectacle. To be seen touching, without context, without permission, was to invite judgment. In medieval Europe, the church offered no ambiguity. Touch before marriage was sin. Touch during marriage, outside of procreation, was suspicion. And yet, dances continued. Maypoles were raised. Lovers met in barns, behind taverns, during market days. Sumptuary laws tried to enforce boundaries. Bans on lace, on ribbons, on how closely men and women could sit at feasts. But lust doesn't listen to legislation, so the touch shifted, became disguised. A dance hand lingered a moment too long. A prayer, shared on a bench, became a brush of the shoulder. And still, panic. Because once a touch went public, it wasn't about pleasure anymore. It was about consequence. A woman caught in a flirtation might lose a suitor. A man seen too often with the same maid might invite scandal. Married couples, ironically, had more freedom to touch, but often less interest. The forbidden touch was the one everyone wanted, the one that came with risk and punishment. In the Islamic world, 4 male witnesses were required to confirm zina, unlawful sex, which made conviction nearly impossible, but accusation, that was easy. A couple seen walking too close, sitting too long. Suddenly, the community whispered, and panic began. Honor killings were not law, but they were real, because in a world where public reputation meant survival, a single touch could be fatal, and so lovers adapted. In Africa, among the Igbo, love was often expressed through storytelling. A tale shared at dusk, a proverb passed in jest. Touch came later, in hidden corners of festivals, under moonlight, shielded by dance. In the Americas, native cultures varied. Some embraced public affection, others considered it taboo. Among the Aztecs, young couples met during celebrations. masked, dancing. A glance might lead to conversation, a shared drink, a future. But if they touched too soon, too boldly, shame followed. The community remembered, because what mattered wasn't morality, it was performance. People could do anything, so long as they didn't get caught. A touch in a temple was sacred, the same touch in a tavern, scandal. A kiss during a festival, romance. The same kiss during a funeral, blasphemy. Context was king, but people forgot, or pretended to, because touch is the body's oldest language. It asks without asking. It remembers what words cannot, and even when the world watches, the hand still reaches, still lingers, still risks, because sometimes that single brush of skin against skin says more than 1,000 vows ever could, even if it leaves behind a panic that never fully fades. They didn't stumble into shame, they built it, carefully, brick by brick, rule by rule, and then they handed it to you, wrapped in scripture, drenched in ceremony, tied with the soft ribbon of good intentions. This isn't punishment, they said. It's protection. This isn't fear. It's morality. But what it really was control. Shame didn't emerge naturally. It wasn't a side effect of desire. It was a system, invented, sharpened, passed down to ensure that your body was never really yours. It begins, as most things do, with a myth. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Inanna celebrates her own sexuality with pride. She sings of her vulva as a lush garden, her lover, her pleasure, divine. But centuries later, those same societies began to erase the joy from that story. Fertility became obligation, passion became danger, and the woman who once spoke her desires out loud, she became a warning. By the time we reach the Hebrew Bible, shame is institutionalized. Eve eats. She knows, she covers, and God, seeing her body, now aware, asks, "Who told you that you were naked?" The answer, of course, is no one had to. Shame had already done its job. From that moment, nakedness was no longer innocence. It was vulnerability, exposure, sin, waiting to happen. And so, modesty was born. But not evenly. In every ancient society, the burden of shame was handed to women first. In ancient India, the Manusmriti declared, a woman must be protected by her father in childhood, her husband in youth, and her sons in old age. At no point was she free. A woman's body was not her own. It was a symbol of family honor, of divine order, of male discipline. Desire, when it surfaced, was either denied or redirected. If a woman expressed it, she was labeled dangerous, seductive, out of control. But if a man failed to control himself, that was her fault too. The idea that a woman's behavior could provoke sin was central to the design. Her clothes too bright, her laugh too loud, her eyes too open. The punishment wasn't always explicit, but it was constant. Whispers, exclusion, blame, and just like that, shame became a second skin. In ancient Greece, this architecture of guilt was dressed up in philosophy. Women were considered incomplete men, less rational, more emotional, prone to hysteria. Their virtue was defined by silence, by obedience. A respectable woman didn't speak in public, didn't walk alone, didn't eat in the presence of men who weren't family. Desire, if it existed, was kept under lock, not for her protection, for his legacy. Because if a child was born from a woman's pleasure, who could guarantee whose child it was? And so the paranoia began. Veils, seclusion, surveillance. In Rome, things were no better. The pudicitia, a Roman virtue meaning modesty or chastity, was elevated as a woman's highest achievement. Statues were carved to honor it. Speeches praised it. But it wasn't about what a woman did, it was about what she resisted. Raped. You'd better not have survived it with dignity, because your composure could be mistaken for consent. Unmarried but pregnant. You were a liability, a disgrace. Your options: marriage, exile, or death. Honor killings didn't begin in modernity. They were alive and well under Roman roofs. In China, Confucianism took the idea of filial duty and fused it to sexual shame. A virtuous woman obeyed her father, her husband, and her son. Widowhood was not a tragedy, it was a lifelong sentence. To remarry, disloyal. To desire again, unthinkable. And yet, people still wanted, still touched, still broke rules. which is why the shame had to be reinforced. Laws weren't enough. They needed rituals. In medieval Europe, women were paraded through town with shaved heads and signs around their necks if accused of adultery. Their crime existing outside the script. Men, of course, were rarely punished the same way. Their sins were private. Her sins, spectacle. Even clothing became a tool of control. In Islamic societies, the hijab and other forms of covering were born from a genuine call for modesty, for privacy. But as centuries passed, the concept expanded beyond religion. It became politicized. Women were told to cover, not just out of faith, but to avoid tempting men, as if the male gaze was their fault, as if a body's mere presence was a provocation. And here lies the quiet violence of shame. It makes you responsible for other people's reactions. It turns your skin into an apology. It tells you that your natural state, your body, your want, your curiosity is something to conceal. In Africa, in many tribal societies, the naked body wasn't shameful at all. Children, women, and men walked unclothed without fear, but colonization brought new rules. Victorian missionaries covered breasts with linen and replaced birth rituals with lectures. They didn't erase the culture, they overwrote it with shame. In Japan's Edo period, sexuality thrived in art, poetry, theatre. The Shunga prints, explicit, beautiful, erotic, were not hidden. They were displayed, celebrated. But when the Meiji government began importing Western values, those same prints were burned, banned, erased. What had once been natural was recast as deviant, and so history repeats. Shame is never just a feeling. It's a blueprint, passed down in silence, folded into lullabies, etched into the lines mothers whisper to daughters. Close your legs. Don't laugh too loudly. Cover that up. Fathers tell sons a different story. Go explore. Just be discreet. Boys will be boys. But girls must be careful, because shame, once internalized, becomes self-policing. You don't need guards at the door when the prisoner builds the walls herself. You don't need punishment when the guilt is inherited. You just need enough stories of women who stepped out of line and didn't come back. And yet, even here, there is resistance. Women in ancient times left graffiti on temple walls, carved with their own names. They wrote poems, stole kisses, fled marriages, kept lovers, performed rituals of their own making, refused to apologize. And when they were erased, others remembered, because shame may be by design, but so is rebellion. A hand unclenched, a shoulder bared, a refusal to whisper. These are not accidents, they are acts of defiance. And history, if you listen closely, is full of women who refused to feel sorry, even when the world told them they should. They said God was watching, but they watched too. The priest, the monk, the oracle, the one sworn to silence, to purity, to lives untainted by flesh, stood at the center of every community. Eyes cast upward, fingers bound in prayer, and yet the heat still reached them. Desire didn't care about robes. It crept in anyway. Even in the most sacred chambers, passion scratched at the walls. In theory, religious life was a refuge from temptation, a retreat, but in practice, it became a pressure cooker, where vows and instincts collided in the dark, and holiness sat uncomfortably close to hunger. Let's begin where the lines first blurred. In the temples of Mesopotamia, priestesses of Inanna served not only as spiritual guides, but in some cases, sacred sexual intermediaries. The practice known later as sacred prostitution is debated today, but what's clear is eroticism and divinity were never far apart. Texts describe ritual unions between kings and temple women, reenactments of the goddess's union with her divine lover Dumuzi. This wasn't casual, it was celebratory, public, divine. The body, in that moment, became liturgy. Not everyone approved. As patriarchal empires rose, these women, once revered, were pushed to the margins, recast as whores, erased from doctrine, but their existence lingered, in poetry, in myth, in the uncomfortable gap between spiritual ecstasy and physical pleasure. In Egypt, priests of Hathor oversaw festivals soaked in wine, dance, and longing. The boundary between worship and indulgence blurred even further. Hymns to the goddess speak of sweetness in the loins, of sacred tremors, and those weren't metaphors. Even the gods weren't celibate. Osiris was seduced and dismembered. Isis rebuilt him, brought him to climax with magic. Their son, Horus, was born from that impossible union, and priests maintained rituals that honored not just their love, but their lust. Religion didn't shun desire, it held it aloft, until suddenly it didn't. As empires grew and men wrote the rules, abstinence became virtue, especially for the clergy. In early Vedic India, brahmacharya, a stage of celibacy and study, was prescribed for boys training to be priests. The logic? Desire distracted. The body's needs interrupted spiritual progress. But, as the Kama Sutra reminds us, that restriction wasn't lifelong. Once studies were complete, a man was expected to marry, to feel, to burn. Still, renunciation lingered. Wandering ascetics rejected sex entirely, claiming the highest path was one without touch. But even they weren't immune. Stories abound of yogis tempted by celestial maidens, of sages tested by gods. Temptation was proof of progress or failure. In Buddhist monastic life, celibacy was central. Desire was seen as suffering, something to transcend, but human minds don't silence easily. Records from ancient monasteries show monks struggling with erotic dreams, with forbidden glances. Temples weren't fortresses, they were classrooms, and desire was the hardest lesson. In Confucian China, priests could marry, but passion was seen as destabilizing. A spiritual leader was expected to be restrained. One rumor and the entire lineage could collapse. So they whispered, left gifts, sang quiet songs disguised as prayer. In Japan's Shinto tradition, the rules were looser. Priests married, Miko danced, symbolic, graceful, but not entirely desexualized. Tales speak of Miko with secret lovers, shrine keepers who blurred duty and desire. These weren't taboos, they were tolerated truths, because no system, no matter how sacred, can fully subtract the human from the holy. Then came the Christians, and the real trouble began. Early Christianity was obsessed with control. The body, once sacred, was rebranded as liability. Paul's letters warned, it's better to marry than to burn. And if you can't be pure, at least be monogamous. Celibacy became law. By the 4th century, priests were to abstain. By the 11th, it was mandatory. But abstinence isn't absence. Monks recorded confessions, dreams, stirrings. Some whipped themselves, some fasted, others gave in. By the 13th century, so many priests had concubines. The church proposed a tax on mistresses, not to stop it, to profit, because passion and priesthood weren't opposites, they were roommates. Priests lived near widows, midwives, lonely wives, and as confessors, they held power, spiritual, emotional, psychological. It was a recipe, and the church knew it, which is why the sermons grew louder. Paintings warned of hell, but the stories kept surfacing. A friar in bed with a novice, a bishop's lover buried in secret beneath the altar, a nun, pregnant, claiming divine intervention. Everyone knew. No one said it out loud, because what happens when passion wears the collar? When the man who gives absolution needs it himself? You shame the woman, move the man, burn the letter, and preach louder. In Islamic history, imams weren't celibate. Marriage was encouraged, but expectations were strict. A spiritual leader had to be above reproach, yet temptation crept in. Poets wrote of imams falling in love with boys, of mystics whose longing for the divine blurred with the longing for another. Sufi poetry danced between flesh and spirit. Beloved could mean God or a man with terrible timing. In the Ottoman Empire, certain dervishes, isolated, ecstatic, fluid, were whispered about, but no one asked too many questions. It was safer not to know. Even in the Americas before colonization, priests weren't immune. Aztec spiritual leaders fasted, bled, abstained, but still they broke. Temples weren't quiet. Desire hummed beneath every robe. Because the priest is still a person, he flinches when touched, dreams when alone, regrets when unseen, and sometimes passion becomes something darker, when shame is weaponized, when silence becomes complicity, when institutions hide abuse beneath holy titles. We can't speak of passion and priesthood without acknowledging the harm. The centuries of silence, the victims erased, the confessions ignored, because when power touches desire, consent becomes complicated, and history looks away. But not always. Some priests loved, secretly, softly. They wrote poems, hid gifts, carved initials into stone walls behind sanctuaries. They didn't betray vows out of malice. They broke under the weight of being told their humanity was incompatible with holiness. It wasn't. It never was. Because passion isn't the opposite of piety. It's the shadow of it. The part we weren't supposed to name, but always felt. There's a metal cage in a museum, shaped like a pair of underpants, hinged at the hips, locked at the front, spiked on the inside. The plaque says it's a chastity belt, used by jealous husbands in the Middle Ages to ensure fidelity while they were off to war. The truth, it's probably fake, or, at the very least, exaggerated. But myths have a habit of surviving longer than facts, especially the ones that humiliate, especially the ones about sex. Let's start with the obvious. Yes, chastity was obsessed over, guarded, weaponized, but the idea that thousands of medieval women were walking around in iron underwear, locked shut by a key their husbands kept around their necks, that's more fantasy than history. Rule: the first so-called chastity belts don't appear in war logs, they appear in satirical poems, French verses from the 12th and 13th centuries, mocking jealous husbands, mocking controlling knights. The belts they described were metaphors, punchlines, not policies, but somewhere along the way, satire hardened into legend. By the 15th century, texts in Europe started mentioning devices of metal and leather to prevent sexual temptation, to prevent infidelity. Some were drawn, some were displayed, but even these felt theatrical, part morality play, part invention, and the few that exist today, in museums in Florence and Paris, were crafted in the 1800s, not as relics, but as curiosities, conversation starters. Warnings, maybe, because the myth of the chastity belt, it served a purpose. It told a story people wanted to believe, that women were so tempting, so untrustworthy, that their bodies had to be locked, that male desire was dangerous, uncontrollable, and had to be managed by guarding the source. In truth, the Middle Ages had subtler methods: marriage contracts, virginity inspections, social isolation, dowry negotiations, public punishment. Why spend money on a lock when guilt worked just as well? And yet, the image lingers. The chastity belt, whether real or not, became a symbol of patriarchy, of paranoia, of the centuries-old obsession with keeping women pure. But what does that even mean? In ancient Rome, pudicitia, chastity, was a civic virtue. A woman's reputation was everything. But she wasn't expected to wear armor. She was expected to wear silence, modesty, and if necessary, a funeral shroud. Because if she lost her chastity, she might as well be dead. In India, Stridharma placed a woman's virtue at the center of the cosmos. A loyal wife stabilized the universe. A widow who stayed faithful earned spiritual merit. But a woman who strayed, she disrupted the natural order. In Confucian China, chaste widows were rewarded, arches built, poems composed, taxes exempted. Others, unable to bear the pressure, took their own lives. Because chastity wasn't just personal, it was public currency, and the price was unbearable. In the Islamic world, modesty and discipline were cultural values, but chastity wasn't enforced with metal belts. It was enforced through surveillance, gender segregation, legal standards impossible to meet. And yet, women were punished anyway, for rumors, for walking alone, for laughing too loudly. The chastity belt, it was invisible, internalized, not iron, fear. In 16th and 17th century Europe, during the witch trials, female sexuality became evidence, or midwife, who knew too much, a widow who flirted, a girl who danced. Their crime wasn't sorcery, it was autonomy. And so, the chastity belt myth fit neatly into that narrative. It reinforced the idea that women's sexuality was dangerous, volatile, and needed to be locked away. It wasn't about protection, it was about control, and men weren't exempt either. In Victorian England, boys were warned that masturbation would cause blindness, insanity, death. Devices were invented, gilded cages, spikes, straps, sold, marketed, worn, because the fear wasn't just about sex, it was about losing control of the body, of the mind, of the story. And the chastity belt told a very simple story. Someone was in charge, but desire doesn't care about keys. It leaks through cracks, hums beneath layers, finds a way. Even in convents, nuns passed letters, shared glances, touched hands during prayer. Even in monasteries, monks wrestled with dreams, guilt, forbidden thoughts they were told to fear, and still they desired, because the body isn't a vault, it's a tide. And chastity, it's not a switch, it's a performance. The chastity belt, then, was never just an object, it was a metaphor for centuries of trying to trap the uncontrollable, to engineer virtue like machinery. It didn't work, and when that failed, they rebranded. Modern purity culture swapped metal for metaphor, chastity rings, abstinence pledges, ceremonies where fathers vow to protect virginity. The key, once hung around a knight's neck, now lives on, in sermons, in songs, in guidance, wrapped in shame. The belt may be gone, but the myth, still buckled tightly around culture, still whispering, desire is dangerous, bodies need borders, love without permission is a sin. But history tells a different story. The belts were fake, the shame was real, and the people behind the myths, women, men, everyone in between, they desired anyway, quietly, desperately, beautifully, because no cage, no key, no story is strong enough to stop a body from wanting, and no myth, no matter how heavy, can keep the truth locked away forever. Desire, they said, was private, but someone was always collecting the receipts. Sex was sacred, personal, taboo, until it wasn't, until someone realized it could be taxed. And suddenly, it became public, organized, institutional, filed under revenue. For all the centuries spent moralizing the body, no civilization ever turned away the money it made. In every corner of history, there were buildings where love, or something like it, could be bought. Brothels and temples, rooms and rituals, less about romance, more about economics, because when it came to sex, the market never closed. Let's start in Mesopotamia, Uruk 5,000 years ago, designated spaces for sex work. Sumerian tablets mention the harimtu, women whose roles were layered, some worked freely, some for temples, all taxed, all acknowledged. They weren't hidden, they were infrastructure, and temple women like the Kadishtu, perhaps priestesses, perhaps lovers, blurred the line between sacred and sensual. Was it worship? Was it ritual? Either way, it was business. In ancient Babylon, the Temple of Ishtar stood at the crossroads of commerce and ecstasy. Coins for favors, grain for fertility, offerings for touch, because salvation sometimes had a price tag. Egypt handled it differently. Temples were sacred, but the streets just outside, bustling with brothels. Graffiti in Deir el-Medina joked about lovers. Papyrus contracts spelled out expectations. Legal, transactional, and profitable. In Greece, things got official. Brothels were state-run, legitimized by lawmakers. Solon, yes, the Solon, established public sex houses with fixed rates. Affordable, predictable, almost civic-minded. Men lined up, coins exchanged, no illusions, just services. Above them, the hetarai, courtesans, not wives, but educated, advisors to philosophers, muses to artists, and far from cheap. They sold presents, elegance, influence. Rome didn't stray far. The empire overflowed with lupanaria, brothels with prices carved in stone. Men, women, boys, all available. Some enslaved, some free. All regulated, all recorded. Even the emperor's ledgers kept lists, because when desire fills the treasury, you don't question where it came from. India brought elegance to economics. The Ganaikas, royal courtesans, lived in refinement, silk, instruments, poetry, clients, poets, kings, merchants. The Arthasastra even recommended a superintendent of courtesans, set prices, prevent abuse, collect taxes. The Kama Sutra spoke of their dignity. A courtesan, it said, may choose, may leave, may feel. China, same melody, different rhythm. The Yinji of Tang cities sang for nobles, recited verses, entertained gently, some forced, some chosen, relicensed, zoned, managed, economy watched, even as hearts broke quietly. Japan's Yoshiwara district, a city inside a city. Lamps, laughter, layers of silk, illusion, all sold. In the Islamic world, brothels existed in the margins, tolerated, sometimes taxed, sometimes ignored. Ottoman records list licenses, bribes, quiet revenue streams, morality and money. Awkward bedfellows. Across Africa, traditions varied. Some welcomed sex workers during festivals, others shunned them, but wherever spice moved, so did desire, caravans, markets, and too often, women traded like goods, slavery, sex work, lines blurred, pain ignored. Temples weren't always safe. In Aztec cities, brothels stood near shrines. Priests warned, nobles visited anyway. Because prohibition isn't prevention, it's just pretense. Medieval Europe grew more hypocritical. The church condemned prostitution, but cities licensed it. Paris, London, Florence, all had designated red light zones, brothels taxed, workers regulated, sin managed, revenue collected. Women wore marked clothes, lived in marked homes, walked marked streets, blamed for disease, blamed for unrest, blamed always, and yet they endured, because mouths still needed feeding, because people still wanted, and because behind every pulpit was someone quietly visiting what they preached against. Even today, echoes remain, strip clubs next to churches, billboards for escorts, beside prayer app ads, desire, ritual, profit, still dancing in a slow, predictable circle, because when lust enters the marketplace, it doesn't knock, it brings a receipt, and every civilization, no matter how holy, has kept the books. The rules were always clear. Desire was allowed, even expected, but only if no one saw it. And if they did, you'd better have a story ready. Because the ancient world, not nearly as repressed as we like to pretend. People flirted, touched, cheated, explored, they just didn't want to be caught. Unless, of course, getting caught was the plan. Take ancient Rome, where virtue was shouted in public, but folded quietly behind villa doors. Men could sleep with slaves, concubines, prostitutes, even the neighbour's wife, as long as no one important noticed. It wasn't the act that brought shame, it was the exposure. Martial joked about men who preached virtue by day and paid boys by night. Ovid wrote entire guides on sneaking past husbands, bribing maids, hiding behind curtains. He wasn't exiled for sin, but for being too good at describing it. Because in Rome, the only real sin was breaking the illusion. In Greece, the affair wasn't the issue. A married man with a hetera, a slave, even a young boy, no one blinked. But touch a freeborn woman or another man's wife, and the consequences came swift. A husband could kill the lover on sight. No trial, just a pulled tunic. A witness, a stain too loud to ignore. But still, people found a way. Courtyards became rendezvous. Stalls sold more than figs. Love notes hidden in sandals. Kisses stolen behind statues. Sometimes, the point was almost getting caught. In India, the Kama Sutra doesn't flinch. It teaches how to read a married woman's eyes, how to bribe the guards, how to slip past suspicion. But it ends with a warning. If you're caught, don't beg. Make her feel it was worth it. Not moral advice. Survival. Because in a world of boundaries, love becomes espionage. In China, adultery among the elite was lethal, especially for women. A man faced shame, a woman, execution. But it didn't stop them. They carved words into fruit skins, met at tea shops under the veil of family errands. She was visiting the shrine. He was seeing a cousin. Servants were hired to spy, but servants could be bought. Some women faked pregnancies. Some men wore robes of monks. And when caught, she tripped. He misunderstood. Nothing happened until someone bled, or confessed, or gave birth to a child with unfamiliar eyes. In the Islamic world, zina, unlawful sex, was forbidden. But proving it required 4 male witnesses. That wasn't leniency, that was design. Be discreet, and you were safe. Be careless, and the law could bury you. So lovers whispered through courtyard cracks, left notes in bread trays, painted messages in henna. Seduction became survival, and danger a stimulant. In medieval Europe, adultery wore a mask. The church condemned. Confession booths multiplied, but kings wrote love letters. Queens trusted poets, and peasants snuck into barns, met at festivals, loved between shadows. Court records reported hair unbound, curfews broken, too many glances, but never the reason why. Loneliness, joy, a single hand that lingered too long. In Edo, Japan, pleasure districts staged secrets. Courtesans played roles. Men pretended to fall in love, and sometimes they did. Affairs outside these walls were riskier. A samurai might fall to scandal, a woman sold, but still, Love poems were tied to lanterns, confessions carved in bamboo, even shame needs somewhere to bloom. Among the Maya, adultery brought punishment, but nobles were protected, commoners negotiated, a weaving comb as confrontation, a dragging before elders. But often, people looked away. Everyone knew, no one wanted to be next. In Africa, customs danced. Some exiled lovers, others allowed it quietly, so long as homes stayed stable. Whispers during hair braiding, glances during drumming, a language of not saying, a necklace worn backwards, a wrong knock, a delayed smile, the real letters written on skin, gone by morning, but sometimes they wanted to be caught, not by law, by each other, because secrecy is lonely, and love wants to be seen. A scarf left behind, a song hummed too loud, not for scandal, for confirmation, because even the forbidden wants to be real, wants to matter. In every culture, two dangers existed, the kind you fear and the kind you crave. Affairs were both, not just sex, but escape, timing, imagination, the want to matter more than you should, so they carved initials, wrote songs, laughed under laws, and kissed beneath stars. Don't get caught, the world warned. Or do, the heart whispered. Because not all love wants a future. Some love just wants to be a secret. It didn't begin with rainbows, or flags, or riots. It began in silence, 2 glances across a crowded market, a brush of hands behind temple walls, a letter folded too many times. Same-sex desire wasn't a glitch. It wasn't new. It wasn't modern. It was always there, in poems, in stone, in myth. But history, ever cautious, ever moral, looked away, and when it couldn't look away, it renamed it. Friendship, brotherhood, artistic admiration, anything but what it was. Desire, the Greeks didn't deny it. They wrote it, sculpted it, sang it. In Athens, the bond between the older Erastes and the younger Aramenos wasn't just accepted, it was idealized. Plato called it the highest form of love. Emotional, intellectual, yes, physical. But even in tolerance, there were rules. The older pursued, the younger received. Once the boy grew facial hair, it ended, because equality was suspicious. Even love had roles. Still, poets like Theognis confessed of longing, of refusal, of boys who wouldn't love them back. These weren't theories, they were ache. In Sparta, desire had purpose. Soldiers who loved fought harder. The Theban sacred band, 150 male couples, famed not for their sex, but their loyalty, dying together, not for romance, for each other. Rome adopted this, but twisted it. A citizen could desire a man, but only if he dominated. To be penetrated, shameful, unless you were a slave, a foreigner, an actor. Even Julius Caesar was mocked. Every woman's man, and every man's woman, not for desire, but for playing the wrong role. Because power still ruled passion, and women, erased. Their love was too hard to police, too threatening, too invisible, so it was mocked, joked about. Marshall laughed at women marrying each other. Not recognition, ridicule. In India, the Tritiya Prakriti, the third nature, had a name. Not law, not shame, just space. The Kama Sutra spoke of women with women, observed, not condemned. Temple carvings showed it. Men in embrace, women intertwined. Art didn't flinch, but as empires came, so did fear, and desire turned to sin, and sin turned to silence. In China's Han Court, Emperor Ai cut his sleeve so his lover wouldn't wake. The passion of the cut sleeve became a metaphor. Poets wrote in moonlight, in dream, in metaphor. Love, refined and tragic. Women, harder to trace. But in the palace shadows, in bathhouses, in braided hair, they touched. Quietly. Audrey Nanshoku, male colours wasn't taboo. It was culture. Buddhist monks, too, felt desire. Sometimes spiritual, sometimes not. But always human. In Europe, the church made rules. Sodomy was sin, punishable, mortal. But it didn't stop. It just hid. Monks confessed. Kings slipped. Richard the Lionheart, Edward II, too obvious to deny, too dangerous to name. In convents, nuns wrote longing. I have loved you more than others. Come back to me, my soul's delight. Was it holy? Was it something else? History stays quiet, but the ache is loud. In Islamic poetry, Abu Nuwas sang of boys with joy, with shame, law condemned, but the poem remained. A boy's face was beauty, danger, desire. It lived in the margins, everywhere and nowhere. In Africa, before colonization, same-sex bonds were not strange. Among the Azande, warriors took younger male wives. Among the Igbo, gender was fluid, ceremonial, negotiable. Then, the colonizers came. British laws, missionary sermons, fires, and silence. In the Americas, two-spirit people were honored. Healers, guides, sacred. They wore both genders, loved freely. But colonization burned that too. Still, carvings survived, letters, glances. Same-sex love was never an error. It was a thread, woven carefully into every culture, every era, every heart, sometimes cut, never destroyed. It came back in a monk's chant, a nun's whisper, a general's grief, a maid's stare. You can outlaw an act, but never a feeling, and history has never truly learned how to look away. It's tempting to think that temples were solemn, that priests never smirked, that gods didn't laugh, but walk quietly through the ruins, listen between the hymns, scratch a little deeper into the stone, and you'll find it. The snort behind the chant, the wink tucked inside a ritual, the body part carved too proudly into the wall. The truth is, the divine and the dirty have never been far apart. They've always shared a roof, because long before sex was taboo, it was holy, and long before holiness was sterilized, it was human. Let's begin in ancient Egypt, where incense curled sweet, and hieroglyphs whispered things you weren't supposed to repeat. At the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, you'll find carvings of naked women with exaggerated genitals. Hathor wasn't a prude. She was the goddess of love, joy, fertility, and festivals that included wine, music, and erotic songs. One hymn, barely translated by academics, speaks of her lotus opening at the sun's command, and the sweet flood that flows from joy. That wasn't just poetry. That wasn't just poetry. That was liturgy. The divine wasn't clean. It was sensual. In Mesopotamia, Inanna's temples echoed with ecstatic verse and ritual sex. Hymns spoke of ploughing her field and erecting the standard of manhood. You can almost hear the snickering behind the tablets. Sumerian poetry, unashamed, unfiltered, performed in public with rhythm, with flourish, with flair for the absurd. Because laughter brought favour, and desire, properly framed, pleased the gods. Now, the Greeks took it further. Worshipped Dionysus, and you didn't kneel. You danced, drank, moaned odes thick with innuendo. Aristophanes imagined women ending a war by withholding sex. Less logic, more hip thrusts. Audiences roared, because to laugh at desire was to tame it. Even statues joined in. Herms, stone pillars with oversized phalluses, stood at crossroads. A fertility symbol, sure, but also a punchline. A literal joke on a pedestal. Rome, as always, turned it into infrastructure. Graffiti at Pompeii's temples and bathhouses said, "I screwed the barmaid, she moaned like a temple singer, and Apelles the weaver sleeps with all the women. Blessings upon him." Because even in the shadow of the gods, people couldn't help themselves. Reverence doesn't erase humour, it invites it. In India, the carvings at Khajuraho tell it loud. Temples built between 950 to CE, covered in scenes of gods, dancers, and people having sex. Every configuration, men with men, women with women, acrobatics, animals, no fig leaves, scholars debate, spiritual metaphors, tantric instructions, warnings, celebrations, a reminder that even in worship, people stayed people. In tantric philosophy, the union of Shiva and Shakti is not symbolic, it's literal. Desire is not the enemy of enlightenment, it's the road. If someone giggled during ritual, the gods didn't mind, they probably laughed too. Now, the church tried to suffocate the instinct. But even inside cathedrals, the jokes slipped through, gargoyles in vulgar poses, monks flashing backsides in the margins of sacred texts, illuminated manuscripts with nuns harvesting phalluses from trees. No context, just there, quietly defiant. The Feast of Fools, an actual festival. Let the lower clergy mock their superiors. They sang nonsense, dressed as bishops, parodied mass. Sometimes they stripped, sometimes they drank. Often they joked about sex. The church hated it, but couldn't quite kill it. because laughter, like desire, has a way of surviving. In Islamic culture, the Maqamat, rhymed prose tales often contained sly sexual humour. Poets like Abu Nuwas sang of wine, boys, and lust with a wink. A cleric might denounce desire in the mosque and write verses about it later that night. Not hypocrisy, complexity. In Japan, Shinto shrines honoured fertility with open joy. The Kanamara Matsuri, still celebrated today, parades giant phallus statues through the streets. People laugh, pray, take selfies, because to honour life, you honour its source, even if it's a steel erection on wheels. Across Africa, Yoruba Orishas like Oshun embody fertility, sensuality, mischief. Her rituals, dance, flirtation, laughter. She is divine and deeply human. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec goddess Tlazoltotl, ruler of lust and purification, was carved mid-copulation, not blasphemy, truth, because even the gods, they believed, needed to let off steam. So here's the real story. The sacred isn't clean, it's messy, sweaty, human, and the people who built temples, they knew that. They carved genitals into lintels, joked about lovers mid-prayer, hid erotic riddles in hymns, not to desecrate the divine, to meet it halfway. If a god made desire, it probably understands the punchline, and maybe is still laughing. What happens after? After the sweat, after the shren, after the room cools down, and the heartbeat fades from the ears? What happens to the body once it remembers it has a name? In the ancient world, this moment, the afterglow, wasn't just a biological lull, it was a portal to meaning, to magic, to something beyond flesh. Because if sex was powerful enough to shake the body, maybe it could stir the soul too. And maybe, just maybe, what you did with your body here followed you somewhere else. Let's begin in ancient Egypt, where life was only half the journey. The afterlife mattered more, mapped out, measured, mythologized. In the Book of the Dead, men prayed, "May I be potent in the next world." Not wise, not pure, potent, able to perform. Sex wasn't abandoned at death's door, it was packed for the journey. Tombs held erotic amulets, fertility spells, paintings of lovers, because whatever came next, desire would be needed, wanted, welcomed. The Greeks, not so different. In the underworld, some souls wept, some wandered, but myths like Orpheus and Eurydice hinted that love, and the longing born from love, could crack even death open. Plato's Symposium spoke of love as cosmic force. Two souls, split forever seeking reunion. The climax of sex wasn't an end. It was the closest mortals got to the divine. To touch, to dissolve, to become, for a moment, infinite. In India, where samsara, the cycle of life and rebirth, meant no act was final, the Kama Sutra didn't just list techniques, it included the after, cooling oils, conversation, stillness. Because after sex, that's when truth speaks loudest. Tantric traditions went further. Sex wasn't a distraction, it was meditation, a quieting of the mind, a dissolving of ego. Orgasm as portal, not heaven, awakening. In early Chinese belief, the life force qi was stored in sexual fluids. After ejaculation, a man lost essence, so Taoists learned to withhold, circulate, preserve. The afterglow wasn't just rest, it was recovery, preparation for longevity. Women, they said, gained energy through orgasm. A man who brought a woman pleasure could live longer. It wasn't just performance, it was self-preservation, maybe even love. In Sufi mysticism, the sensual mirrored the spiritual. Rumi wrote, "The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you." Desire wasn't a distraction from God, it was a map to him. In medieval Europe, the church tried to rewrite the ending. Sex was for procreation, pleasure was guilt, the afterglow, shame, confession, penance. They preached that saints died virgins, that the body was a trap. But even here, cracks formed. Mystics like Teresa of Avila described divine ecstasy with breathlessness, tears, trembling, the language of climax, disguised as revelation. In Buddhist monasteries, desire was watched, not indulged, not condemned, observed. The afterglow became a kind of mirror, smoke rising, then clearing. Among the Aztecs, Tlazolteotl governed both sin and cleansing. She encouraged pleasure, then offered forgiveness. You sinned, you confessed, you were reborn. The afterglow was absolution. In Africa, Oral tradition held that ancestors watched all things, especially sex, because sex meant life, continuity, legacy. To lie with someone wasn't just biology, it was testimony, to joy, to lineage, to being alive in a world that didn't promise tomorrow. In indigenous North American cultures, the act was private, but never shameful, respectful, honest. There was nothing to regret. The afterglow was peace. And yet, in every tradition, the body after sex felt different, weakened, strengthened, sacred, a time for truth, a time for vulnerability, a time when eyes lingered too long and promises were made too easily, and sometimes kept. Even now, we call it pillow talk, that haze between clarity and confusion. We think we invented that. We didn't. The Egyptians buried perfume jars near the pelvis. The Greeks wrote love poems to sleeping lovers. Indian sages urged stillness, not from modesty, but awe. Taoists listened to their own pulse. Monks wrestled with dreams. Wives lay beside men who didn't speak. Courtesans watched clients slip into silence. Lovers held hands just long enough to feel real. See, Afterglow has always been a mirror of what we wanted, of what we feared, of what we hoped would follow us into whatever comes next. Because maybe we are never more human than in that one moment just after, when the mask drops, when the words falter, when the body, finally still, asks, did that mean something? And someone in stone, or ash, or ink, someone answers, yes, even if it only lasted a minute. Yes, even if no one remembers. Yes, even if there is no next life, because for that breathless instant, you were infinite. The records talk about bodies, who touched whom, who paid, who punished, who ran. But what about love? Not the kind carved into temple stone, not dynastic alliances, not ritual unions, not duty in disguise. Real love. The chest tightening, palm sweating, do they feel it too kind? Did they feel it, miss it, die from it? Where kings prayed, not just for reign or victory, but for tenderness. In the Sumerian love songs of Shu-Sin, a queen sings, of longing, of secret meetings, of thighs trembling at his approach. This wasn't politics, it was yearning. The clay tablets don't blush, they remember. In Egypt, love was soft, sunlit. The harper's songs, etched into tombs, speak of fleeting joy, of kisses timed to the lotus bloom, of hearts swelling like the Nile. One poem whispers, my heart flutters hastily when I think of you. It lets me not act sensibly, it leaps from its place. That's not metaphor, that's love, the same nervous chest, the same helpless grin, the same wondering, do they feel it too? Their gods modelled it. Isis mourned Osiris so deeply, she rebuilt him. Love, they believed, could piece the dead back together. In Greece, love had many names, eros, philia, agape. But it was eros that made people lose sleep, and sanity, and sometimes their lives. Sappho wrote of women whose presence left her breathless, burning. She didn't describe conquest, she described collapse. He appears to me equal to the gods, the man who sits beside you and listens to your sweet voice. Plato believed love was soul ache. Two halves, split at birth, wandering lifetimes, trying to find each other again. He said real love makes you want to be better. Rome made everything louder, drunker, messier. But even there, real love peeked through. Catullus cursed his own heart for loving Lesbia, even when she humiliated him, even when he hated her. I hate and I love. Why do I do this, perhaps you ask? I do not know, but I feel it happening, and I am tortured. Love wasn't always pretty, but it was never fake. In India, the Kama Sutra isn't just a how-to manual. It lists emotions. It tells how you'll forget to eat, how dreams become crowded, how you start seeing their name in tree bark, how flaws start to feel like jewelry. It talks of quarrels, of separation, of return. The Ramayana tells of Sita, held captive, insulted, refusing to betray Rama even in thought. Her love wasn't passive, it was fire in disguise. And in softer verses, lovers met in monsoons, shared mangoes, wrote letters in eyeliner on banana leaves. Because even if you had nothing, you could still have love. In China, love lived in poetry. Du Fu, Li Bai, Wang Wei, they wrote of empty beds lit by moonlight, of women who aged while waiting, of men who crossed rivers just to hear a single laugh again. It wasn't spectacle, it was ink, soaked deep into silk. One tale tells of Emperor Xuanzong, who loved Yang Guifei so much he neglected his empire. When rebels came, his guards demanded she die. He agreed, and then he never smiled again. Did she love him? Maybe. Did he love her? The poets think so. In Japan's Heian court, lovers exchanged fans, poems passed under doors. Lady Murasaki wrote the tale of Genji, capturing jealousy, ecstasy, heartbreak. Lovers wept at each other's sleeves, waited for the wind to carry their scent. To fall in love was to risk your name, your standing, your soul, but they fell anyway. Islamic poets sang of divine love, but it always felt flesh-warm. Rumi confessed, "The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you." They wrote in mosques and in bedrooms, because sometimes the line between God and lover was just one heartbeat wide. In Africa, love was sung, not written. Griots told of lovers who ran, who waited, who carved their initials into baobab trees, then returned decades later to find them still there. Love was rhythm, drumbeat, breath. It was call and response. Among the Aztecs, Nahuatl poetry used flowers and fire. Love outlasted war, outlasted death. Even as cities fell, people still fell, still hoped, still whispered, even in tongues now lost. And what of same-sex love? It existed, openly in some places, secretly in others. The words may change, the names may vanish, but the feelings, actingly familiar, they waited beneath windows, they dreamed the same dreams. Even when forbidden, they fell anyway, because we don't choose the shape of love, only whether to follow it, and yet we still ask, did they ever fall in love? As if ancient people were different, as if stone houses couldn't hold soft hearts, as if the past was immune to poetry. But every sigh still echoes, in temples, in brothels, on battlefields, and especially in bedrooms, where two people looked at each other and didn't look away. Love wasn't the exception, it was the pulse beneath everything else. There were rules, there were gods, laws, warnings etched into bone. Councils said desire must be tamed. Priests promised punishment. Elders pointed at the sky and whispered, "Not like that." But none of it worked, because the hunger always returned. It wasn't always lust, not exactly. Sometimes it was the ache of loneliness in a crowded room. Sometimes it was the flutter of a name said too softly. Sometimes it was just the raw, simple truth. To be human is to want, to reach across the void and hope something reaches back. This wasn't new, it wasn't modern, it was ancient, primal, prehistoric. They scratched it into cave walls, curves, hips, faceless bodies in motion. In the dark, with a torch, those shapes breathed. They weren't pornography. They were prayer, to touch, to be touched, to be seen. Paleolithic burials tell on them. Venus figurines, breasts, hips, thighs, we say fertility symbols. Maybe, or maybe they were about longing. Not for children, but for closeness. The ache to connect, the tremor of maybe I matter. Later, when cities rose and gods got names, they turned that hunger into ritual. Temples to Ishtar, to Aphrodite, to Hathor, goddesses who didn't demand shame, only offerings. Men brought wine, women brought perfume, and sometimes they brought their bodies. Not for money, for meaning, because the oldest hunger wasn't always sex, it was belonging. In Rome, Pompeii whispered the same stories we still hear, graffiti on brothel walls. We were here, we loved, we wanted. One man wrote, "I screwed the barmaid." Another, "Success was here first." Crude, maybe, but also tender. Proof someone wanted to be remembered, that someone else mattered. In India, they mapped it. The Kama Sutra didn't reduce it. It dissected it, respected it. How to touch, how to wait, how to listen, because the ache wasn't a mistake. It was a skill. China had scrolls too. The art of the bedchamber. Taoist manuals, yin and yang, not as opposites, but invitations. Men were taught not to rush, women not to hide, and both were told, this matters. Not just the act, the silence around it, the breath after, because hunger doesn't stop at climax. It lingers, it repeats, it asks again. In Japan, lovers sent poems, not "I want you," but "the moon was high and you weren't there." Same hunger, different syllables. Africa danced it. Hips swayed in memory. Feet stomped out grief. Bodies moved because words weren't enough. The griots remember. The girl who ran with the drummer. The man who wept for a touch he couldn't name. The hunger was never just about bodies. It was about recognition, about mattering. The Americas wove it into myth. Maya gods fell for mortals. The sun chased the moon, not to catch her, but to warm his face in her light. The Aztecs didn't ban the hunger, they blessed it. Tzlodolteotl, goddess of lust and purification. Even dirt, they said, could become sacred. But then came the shame, the missionaries, the colonizers, the lawmakers. This is wrong, they said. This must be punished. This must be erased. They rewrote hunger as sin, as sickness. They buried it beneath doctrine, but it never left. Even when they outlawed brothels, even when they burned scrolls, even when they said your body belongs to your husband, your god, your country, the hunger stayed. It just changed shape, or wore uniforms. It sat in pews. It prayed for forgiveness before slipping out the window. It whispered, "I want," and history whispered back, "So do I." Because what's more human than this? To wake up lonely, to see someone laugh and feel your chest twist, to dream of a hand you've never touched. The hunger isn't just in the groin, it's in the wrist that writes letters you never send, in the breath you hold when they walk into the room, in the way you almost say it and don't. And in every era, they felt it. The virgin who carved a name into stone, the monk who dreamed of mouths, the queen who stared too long at her handmaiden, the priest who lingered during confession. They didn't always act on it, but it was there, and sometimes they gave in. Behind market stalls, in alleys, in curtained rooms, for one breathless, trembling second, the world dropped away. No titles, no gods, no judgment, just two people, hoping to be seen, hoping it would last. It didn't, but it was enough to echo through time, to leave marks on walls, in poems, in laws written by frightened men. Because hunger, it cannot be destroyed, only disguised, so they called it madness, witchcraft, criminality, lust, addiction, temptation, everything but what it was, need, not just for sex, for closeness, for softness, for the unbearable relief of being wanted. And we, modern, enlightened, we think we've evolved, but look closer. The ads that promise love in 30 seconds, the apps that sort desire like produce, the songs that beg for touch, we haven't escaped the hunger. We just gave it new furniture. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the point was never to conquer it. Maybe it was to remember that we were built from it, shaped by it, haunted by it, loved by it.